Welcome to Alex's History Lessons. Hello, Quarto di Eso. It's Alex here. I hope you are all well. Today I want to speak about an event in history which changed the world forever and that we, to this very day, still feel its effects. The Second World War. My World War II Explained series of videos has 3 parts. You are now watching and listening to Part 1, The Causes of the Second World War. Part 2 will look at the Second World War itself in more detail, and Part 3 will look at the legacy of the Second World War. There were many causes of the Second World War. Here we have a list of some of the major causes, which include the rise of Hitler and fascism, nationalism and militarism in Germany, the Treaty of Versailles and its conditions for Germany, Japanese expansionism, rise of fascism in Italy, Italian expansionism, the Great Depression. We shall also look at the appeasement policy of Britain and France, who did not do enough to prevent the war. Finally, we shall also look at the League of Nations and their failures, and the failures of the United States of America in also preventing a Second World War. Although historians argue over when the Second World War started, many agree that it started in 1939 when Nazi Germany invaded Poland. But as historians, we must go back to think about what were the causes of the Second World War. We could go back to the 19th century and the continued rise and dominance of European empires who took land in huge quantities and controlled millions of people across the continents of Africa, Asia, and across the world. But in this lesson, we are going to start at the end of the First World War. In November 1918, the First World War ended when Germany and her allies were defeated by the Empire of Great Britain, France, Russia, and the United States of America. The Treaty of Versailles was designed by the leaders of Great Britain, France, and the United States of America. It was signed in 1919. The terms of the treaty ordered Germany to accept all the blame for starting the First World War. It ordered Germany to pay a huge $31.4 billion in reparations money. Germany had to make substantial territorial concessions, and part of Germany, called the Rhineland, was demilitarized. Germany had to cut its army to 100,000 soldiers, its navy to 6 battleships with no submarines, and Germany was not allowed an air force. The Treaty of Versailles humiliated Germany while failing to resolve the underlying issues that had led to war in the first place. As time went on, it caused huge resentment among the German people. The amount of money that Germany had to pay was far too great. To try and solve this problem, Germany printed more and more money. But this meant that the money became worthless. This was called hyperinflation. The price of a loaf of bread rose from 163 marks in November 1922 to 200 billion marks in November 1923. Germany was financially suffocated. Over time, Germany was unable to pay all the reparations that it was expected to. Matters were made even worse when in 1923 French and Belgian troops occupied the heavily industrialized Ruhr region of Germany until August 1925. The worldwide economic Great Depression caused a huge amount of unemployment, misery, and starvation in Germany and in countries across the world. Between 1919 and 1933, Germany was democratically governed by the Weimar Republic. Unfortunately for Germany and the rest of the world, by 1933, the Weimar Republic had failed. The democratic Weimar Republic failed because of a poorly designed political constitution, the crushing conditions of the Treaty of Versailles, the Great Depression, and the huge unemployment it caused, hostility to democracy and parliament from radical political parties, including the Nazi Party and the Communist Party. The Weimar Republic also failed because of conspiracy theories from far right-wing nationalists against the democratic government, against socialists, against liberals, and against Jews. Military organizations and far-right political parties also undermined Weimar democracy with militaristic, nationalistic, and authoritarian ideas. And then there was the huge rise in support for Hitler and the Nazi Party. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party rose in popularity throughout the 1920s in Germany. In 1933, Hitler became Chancellor and promised to return Germany to greatness. With Hitler and the Nazi Party in power, they tripled the size of the German military. They banned rival political parties. They stopped protests, and they executed political opponents. In 1934, Hitler became the absolute leader of Germany and was known as the Führer. Lebensraum, which means living space, was the ideal that the German state would expand to the east to gain more lands for their people to live in, and crucially, more resources to feed and fuel the nation. The Japanese had the same idea, where they wanted lands in Korea and China and in East Asia to feed and fuel their growing empire. Resources were going to play a huge part in the Second World War, especially food. As we will see in the next video, millions and millions of civilians and soldiers died of starvation during the Second World War and after it. As we have learned in the previous class on fascism, Italy also had a fascist dictator in Benito Mussolini. Italy also had an expansionist policy and invaded and occupied Abyssinia, which is modern-day Ethiopia, in 1935 until 1937. The Italians also used chemical weapons against the Ethiopians. War crimes were committed by both sides, with the Italians in particular committing terrible massacres. During the Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 1939, Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy tested their armies against the Republican Army, which was backed by the USSR. But why was nothing done to stop all of this? Well, in 1920, the League of Nations was created. This was a diplomatic league which grew to 63 countries eventually. Some of the aims of the League of Nations included to keep world peace by discouraging aggression from any nation, encourage cooperation between countries to boost trade and commerce, to enhance living and working conditions, to persuade nations to disarm, and to uphold the Peace Treaty of Versailles. The League of Nations was able to successfully resolve some conflicts, but it couldn't resolve many others. One huge problem was that the USA, who had effectively designed the League of Nations, didn't join it. Although the Soviet Union were admitted to the League in 1934, it is important to remember that all of Europe and North America and the Western world had a constant fear of communism coming from the Soviet Union. Ultimately, there were too many problematic nations with problematic authoritarian, totalitarian leaders and too much division for the League to control and negotiate with. Ultimately, the League of Nations failed to prevent a Second World War. Britain and France were terrified of another world conflict that would surely destroy their global empires. They were also extremely fearful of communist Russia. Britain and France entered into an appeasement policy, which meant that they didn't intervene enough to put a stop to Hitler and the Nazi Party's expansionist policy. Anti-Semitism was endemic across Europe in the 1930s. In Nazi Germany, repressive laws and violence against Jews became even more brutal, as the years went on. German people discriminated and attacked Jewish people throughout the 1930s, culminating in Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass, when many Jews were attacked and killed right across Germany. We will talk more about the Holocaust in the next lesson. In 1938, Nazi Germany annexed Austria and invaded Czechoslovakia. Germany and Italy were ready for war. Meanwhile, in Asia, Japan had been fighting against China throughout the 1930s and had invaded large parts of the country. Japan had an expansionist policy and were extremely nationalistic. They also used chemical and biological weapons against the Chinese and murdered millions of Chinese and other East Asian civilians. Japan were not only attacking China, they were ready for a world war. World War II officially began on the 1st of September 1939 when Germany invaded Poland. 2 weeks later, the Soviet Union also invaded Poland. As we have seen, there were many causes of the Second World War, ranging from the conditions of the Treaty of Versailles, the failure of the League of Nations, the aggression and expansionist policies of Japan, Italy, and Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. We must also look at the policy of appeasement and consider if a different approach may have been more successful or not. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.